The annual Thetford Guy Fawkes celebration was meant to be the town's finest display in decades. Instead, it became Norfolk's most investigated firework disaster. Detective Inspector Helen Ashworth arrived at Thetford Market Square just after midnight on November 6th, the acrid smell of spent fireworks still hanging in the cold air. The medieval market square, normally peaceful after centuries of quiet commerce, was now a maze of police tape and forensic markers. Steam rose from puddles where emergency vehicles had tracked water across the ancient cobblestones. In the center, where the professional firework display had been mounted just hours earlier, chalk outlined the position where 53-year-old Graham Whitlock had died. "What do we know?" Ashworth asked Sergeant Paul Dennison, her breath visible in the frigid Norfolk night. Graham Whitlock, event coordinator for the past 12 years, Dennison consulted his notebook. Killed instantly when a firework mortar launched horizontally into the crowd barrier area instead of skyward. He was checking the safety perimeter when it struck him. Ashworth examined the scene. Steel mortar tubes lay scattered across the cobblestones, their bases still attached to heavy metal plates. One tube pointed at an odd angle toward the crowd barrier, 30 meters from where it should have been aimed at the sky. Professional display? Aye, hired from Starlight Pyrotechnics in Norwich. Same company they've used for 5 years running. The operator, David Henley, is shaken but cooperative. Says nothing like this has ever happened with his equipment. The market square still bore evidence of the evening's celebration. Abandoned programs scattered across wet cobblestones advertising Thetford's spectacular skyward display. Food stalls stood empty, their serving hatches still open as if the vendors had fled mid-transaction. Children's glow sticks blinked weakly in puddles, their batteries slowly dying as the investigation began. The ancient guild hall loomed over the scene, its Tudor timbers blackened by centuries of weather, bearing silent witness to this modern tragedy. Ashworth crouched beside the displaced mortar tube. This was aimed toward the crowd. According to witnesses, it shifted during the display, started vertical, ended up nearly horizontal by the time the fatal firework launched. David Henley sat in his van, hands shaking as he poured tea from a thermos. At 42, he'd been operating professional firework displays across East Anglia for 15 years without incident. His Starlight Pyrotechnics van was immaculate, equipment secured in custom compartments, insurance certificates prominently displayed. The tragedy had shaken him to his core. In his 15 years of professional pyrotechnics, he'd never had so much as a minor burn, let alone a fatality. "I've never seen anything like it," Henley told Ashworth, his voice hoarse from hours of police interviews. The mortar was properly positioned, checked twice during setup. The base plate was secure. "I've used that exact same equipment configuration hundreds of times across Norfolk, Suffolk, and Cambridgeshire. Walk me through your setup process." Henley led her to the remaining mortars. "We arrived at 2 o'clock to set up. Graham helped us carry the equipment from the van. Standard procedure, mortars positioned according to the safety plan, base plates leveled, angles checked with an inclinometer. Everything was textbook." "Who else helped with setup?" "Graham, obviously, Trevor Banks from the council, and a few volunteers. Everyone stayed well back from the actual positioning. Only Graham and I handled the mortars directly." Ashworth examined one of the intact base plates, heavy steel, roughly 18 inches square, with adjustable legs for leveling. "These look sturdy enough." "They are. Each plate weighs 40 pounds and can handle mortars up to 6 inches. The one that shifted was a 4-inch tube, well within specifications." "What about the ground conditions?" Henley paused. "That's what's been bothering me. The market square should be solid. It's been cobbled for centuries, but when we were setting up, I noticed some of the stones seemed a bit loose in that area." Trevor Banks, Thetford Town Council's events coordinator, met them at the Guildhall the following morning. At 61, he'd overseen the Guy Fawkes celebrations for 8 years, taking pride in the event's growth from a modest bonfire to Norfolk's premier firework display. "Graham was meticulous about safety," Banks said, settling into his office chair. Every year, he'd spend weeks planning the display, checking regulations, coordinating with the fire brigade. He knew those mortars better than anyone. Tell me about the ground preparation. Banks looked uncomfortable. Well, that's where things get complicated. We had some work done on the square last month, utility repairs. Thames Valley Water replaced some pipes running under the cobbles. Did that affect the display area? Not directly, but Banks pulled out a folder. The contractors had to excavate near where the mortars were positioned. They assured us everything was properly backfilled and the cobbles reset correctly. Ashworth made notes. Who was the contractor? Hartwell and Sons, local firm. They've done work for the council before. Good reputation. Did anyone inspect the area before the display? Banks shifted uncomfortably. Graham walked the area the day before, said it looked fine. The cobbles were all in place, appeared solid. We had no reason to suspect any problems. Jim Hartwell of Hartwell and Sons arrived at the police station looking haggard. His construction company had served Thetford for 3 generations, building a reputation for careful, quality work. The suggestion that his crew's work had contributed to a death clearly weighed heavily on him. We followed all proper procedures, Hartwell insisted. The water main replacement required digging a trench about 4 feet deep, right along the eastern edge of the market square. We backfilled with certified aggregate, compacted in lifts, reset the cobbles exactly as they were. How close was your excavation to where the mortars were positioned? Hartwell consulted his site drawings. About 3 meters away, close enough that if our backfill wasn't properly compacted, it could affect the stability of the surrounding area. Could it have caused settling? In theory, yes, but we used a vibrating plate compactor, did everything by the book. The work was inspected by building control before we restored the cobbles. Ashworth studied the site drawings. When was this work completed? October 15th, 3 weeks before the display. Any follow-up inspections? Hartwell hesitated. The official inspection was the day we finished. But with the recent rains we've had, there could have been some settling. Ground conditions have been saturated. The forensic engineering report arrived 5 days later. Dr. Sarah Pemberton from East Anglia Technical Services had examined the displaced mortar, base plate and ground conditions with methodical precision. Her investigation had included ground-penetrating radar surveys, soil density measurements, and detailed photographic documentation of the failure pattern. The base plate failure was caused by differential settling, Dr. Pemberton explained to Ashworth. The eastern legs of the base plate sank approximately 4 inches into the ground during the display, tilting the mortar from its original near-vertical position to roughly 30 degrees from horizontal. What caused the settling? Recent excavation work created a zone of disturbed soil adjacent to the mortar position. Combined with heavy rainfall in the week before the display, we had 47 millimeters of rain in the 5 days preceding the event. The backfilled area became critically unstable. The vibrations from other fireworks firing triggered progressive settlement of the foundation. Would this have been visible during setup? Not necessarily. The initial settling probably occurred gradually during the first half of the display. The cobbles would have masked the movement until it became severe. Could anyone have predicted this? Dr. Pemberton paused thoughtfully. A geotechnical survey might have identified the risk, but that's not standard practice for temporary firework displays. The combination of recent excavation, saturated ground conditions, and vibrational loading created a perfect storm for foundation failure. The inquest was held 3 weeks later in Norwich Crown Court. Coroner Margaret Holt listened to testimony from witnesses, technical experts, and investigators. The courtroom was packed with Thetford residents, many still struggling to understand how their beloved celebration had turned tragic. David Henley testified about his setup procedures, his voice steady but his hands still shaking slightly. I followed exactly the same process I've used for 15 years. The equipment was properly positioned and secured. I had no way of knowing the ground conditions were unstable. Jim Hartwell took the stand looking older than his 58 years. We completed the water main work to specification, passed all inspections. If I'd known there was going to be heavy equipment positioned near our excavation area, I might have recommended additional ground stabilization. Trevor Banks' testimony revealed the coordination gap that had proved fatal. The firework display planning began in September before the utility work was scheduled. There was no formal process for assessing how the construction might affect the display setup. Dr. Pemberton's technical testimony was sobering. The mortar began tilting approximately 15 minutes into the display, moving roughly 1 degree every few minutes as repeated firework launches vibrated the unstable base plate. By the time the fatal firework was launched, the tube was angled at approximately 30 degrees from vertical. Several witnesses described the moments before Graham Whitlock's death. Margaret Olson, who had been managing the refreshment stand, testified that she'd noticed one mortar looking a bit off, but assumed it was supposed to be angled that way. Graham was so thorough about everything, I thought it must be intentional. Teenager Jamie Foster, who'd been collecting litter near the safety barrier, described the final moments. Mr. Whitlock was walking along the barrier, checking that everyone stayed back. He looked up at the fireworks just as that one went off sideways. He didn't have time to move. The coroner's verdict was clear: accidental death. Graham Whitlock died as a result of a tragic combination of circumstances that created an unforeseeable risk, Coroner Holt stated. While multiple parties contributed to the conditions that led to this accident, none bear criminal responsibility. This was a case of unfortunate timing and circumstances beyond reasonable prediction. The verdict brought little comfort to Graham's widow, Susan, or their 2 adult children. Outside the courthouse, Susan spoke briefly to reporters. Graham loved organizing the Guy Fawkes display. He always said it was about bringing the community together safely. He would be devastated to know that his dedication to safety couldn't prevent this accident. The tragedy led to immediate changes in event planning procedures across Norfolk and beyond. The County Council implemented new requirements for ground condition assessments when temporary structures are erected near recent excavation work. Professional pyrotechnic companies now conduct soil stability checks for displays in areas with potential ground instability. Starlight Pyrotechnics added ground-penetrating radar surveys to their standard setup procedures. Graham's death taught us that even experienced professionals can't account for every variable, David Henley said 6 months later. We now assume nothing about ground conditions. Every display site gets a full geotechnical assessment. The tragedy rippled through Thetford's tight-knit community of 24,000 residents. Graham had been a familiar figure at local events for over a decade, volunteering for everything from summer fetes to Christmas markets. Thetford cancelled its Guy Fawkes celebration for 2 years, the trauma too fresh for the close-knit community. When the display finally returned in 2018, it was held in the rugby club field outside town, on virgin ground with verified stability. The first display back drew 4,500 people, making it one of the largest in Norfolk as surrounding communities showed their support. A memorial bench near the market square bears a simple inscription: Graham Whitlock, 1964-2017, dedicated to community safety. The bench sits where the mortars were positioned that fatal November night, a quiet reminder that tragedy can emerge from the intersection of good intentions, professional competence, and the unpredictable nature of the ground beneath our feet.